We're delighted to have with us a member of President Biden's cabinet, the Secretary of Commerce, the Honorable Gina Raimondo. And before turning over to her, let me congratulate you, Secretary Raimondo, on the announcement of the step back in the tariff conflict over steel and aluminum with the European Union. That obviously feeds into our important discussion today, where you're joining us to speak about supply chain issues and global trade. Thank you, Secretary Raimondo.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate that, and I appreciate that kind and warm introduction. It's wonderful for me to be here with you and to be joined by Minister Tharman. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, all the distinguished guests. You have a terrific panel and a terrific day lined up. So as you all know, recently at the East Asia Summit, President Biden reaffirmed our commitment to the Indo-Pacific region, and he outlined his vision for the region, one that's open, connected, prosperous, resilient, and importantly, secure. He announced the development of an Indo-Pacific economic framework that will define our shared objectives around standards for the digital economy and technology, supply chain resiliency, topic on the top of everyone's mind, decarbonization, infrastructure, and other areas of shared interest. Of course, I applaud the president for this, and the Commerce Department will be kind of central to developing that economic framework and working with our partners in the region to develop and execute on that. We're already moving forward with a new U.S.-Singapore partnership for growth and innovation that will integrate our economies even further. And the U.S. and Singapore have committed to a high-level dialogue on supply chains. Again, something I am focused on this day in and day out. And so it's exciting to work with our partners in Singapore to try to find some solutions to our supply chain challenges and develop long-term resiliency. I've been the co-chair of the President's Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force, and of course, hope to bring all of that work to my work here in the Indo-Pacific region. In the US, we're taking a dual approach of investing in domestic manufacturing, as well as pursuing what we're calling friendshoring, so that like-minded partners like all of you are fully integrated into our supply chains. And that means looking for areas of greater collaboration, increased transparency, agreement on supply chain resiliency principles, sharing best practices, identifying diverse sources of supply, and coordinating investments in alternative supply chains. And we hope to expand our partnerships across Asia to strengthen the commercial ties between our companies, which will improve business conditions and help us to combat climate change in America and in the region. I will say I am really looking forward to the engagement in the region and working with like-minded partners to get the job done. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you. And again, just thank you so much for having me this morning.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We're going to have an on-the-record discussion, which the Secretary and the Senior Minister have graciously agreed to give, and to have two leaders of the global economy come together is a great opportunity for the next step conference. Just let me say again that Tharman is the Senior Minister in Singapore, having served for several years as Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. He's concurrently Chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies. So like Secretary Raimondo, the government of Singapore and the Biden administration are very concerned about the linkages of trade, social outcomes, and political stability. Tharman also co-chairs the G20 High-Level Independent Panel on Financing Pandemic Security and chairs the Group of 30, which is a leading independent global council of economic and financial leaders. Let me start just going quickly to Tharman for a response to the list of initiatives that Secretary Raimondo started with. How does Singapore see the U.S. moving forward in the region now, and how do you see this concept of friendshoring? I think that's a new coinage. So how does that strike you? And then we'll turn back to the Secretary.
Thanks, Adam, and I'm very happy to be here with Secretary Raimondo. I would say the underlying principle is that of diversification. And diversification comes out of all the uncertainties that we face globally. COVID-19 has led to a step change in the way in which global corporations, as well as, I'd say even medium-sized corporations, are thinking about supply chains. Not just their own manufacturing supply chains, but also logistics networks. And I don't think we're going back to where we were 2 years ago. But it's not about a retreat from globalization as much as it is about diversifying supply chains and better risk management. Better risk management, including a whole set of practices, including inventories, but also that ability to flex production from one site to another at short notice. And that's now becoming part and parcel of advanced management for companies all over the world. It offers, I think, a place in the world for ASEAN. It offers a place in the world for most developing regions. And I think what we really want to do is to try and avoid this being a either or. In other words, either you're part of a US network or US catalyzed network of supply chains, or you're part of a China or other network of supply chains. I think the world will be much worse off if that were the case. It'll be worse off for each of the major economies. It'll be worse off for the developing world. We've got to try and mitigate as much as we can the risk of bifurcation of supply chains, of technology standards, and even of norms. So that's our challenge. And we've got to all play our part in trying to ensure as much as possible that we are in an open and connected world, not just for goods and services, but increasingly for data and digital services. That's the next major project for the WTO and for all of us. That's the next major project. And I believe it is possible. I believe it is possible. Just as it was never to the advantage of individual countries or the world to have frictionful or choked up supply chains and goods and traditional services, it's not going to be in anyone's interest to have anything other than a free flow of data and digital services around the world. People sometimes say that data is like oil. It is and it isn't, because unlike oil, unlike goods in general, data is what the economists call a non-rival good. It's non-rivalrous. In other words, your consuming data doesn't make it less possible for someone else to consume data. And it's in the very nature of data that the more there is, and the more extensively it is used everywhere in the world, the more innovation you're going to get, the more productivity growth you're going to get, the more you improve well-being everywhere. So it's a bit like the global commons. Unlike traditional trade in goods and services where competition is good and it spurs efficiency and so on and so forth, here it's not just about competition. It is a non-rival good. It's in everyone's interests that we have that free flow of data, and it means we do need to have principles governing the cross-border flow of data, and we need principles governing the flow of everything else, capital goods, services, everything else, which now embed more data than ever before. And that's the new multilateral framework that we need for data. It's a major project. Several countries have started off on a bilateral and a plurilateral basis. The US and Singapore see eye to eye on it. Several of our partners do. Japan, Canada, New Zealand, the Europeans increasingly, and I believe China will as well, because it's in China's interests. So that's an opportunity. And I'll just stop there, Adam.
Thank you, Tharman. Turning back to the Secretary, you may want to respond to some of that, but putting in the broader context, I mean, we are all very much aware, given recent economic developments and the COVID crisis, of the importance now of global supply chains. There seems to be a general assessment, which I agree with, that supply chains may have gotten too tenuous, not sufficiently diversified and resilient. How do you see the trends for right-sizing supply chains? And what role do you see governments like the Commerce Department in the US playing in this process?
Yes, thank you. So first, I want to take a second to respond to what Tharman was saying, much of which I agree with, all of which I agree with. But, you know, the interesting thing about data, unlike oil, is it's also unlimited. It's an infinite supply. And that's, I think, a key difference. The other thing is, although, of course, I agree with you that we don't want to set up, as you say, bifurcation, we do need trusted networks. You know, underpinning data are networks, and they have to be trusted. You know, they have to be trusted networks, and the standards which govern networks, the privacy protections, the cyber protocols. We are looking forward to engaging in the region with Singapore and other like-minded, you know, democracies around the world to write the rules of the road as it relates to data and digitization, consistent with our belief in privacy, our democratic values, so that we can have trusted networks, which we believe will only enhance our ability to have, you know, a global economy that you describe, because trust will underpin our ability to collaborate. To your question, Adam, about supply chains, you know, I think I can safely say that we didn't pay much attention to supply chains. You know, the other day yesterday, my husband and I were at the farmer's market, and we were buying some pasta, you know, local homemade pasta, and, you know, from a small stand at a farm stand. And the fellow was talking to me about supply chains and how the supply chain disruption was upsetting his very small business. And so we went from a place of not paying attention to a place of being obsessed with it. And I hope we've learned that lesson, which is to say we cannot take our eye off the ball of developing resilient, diverse supply chains, because we're living through a painful period now where these disruptions in our supply chains are affecting even the smallest businesses, of course, up to the biggest businesses. So, you know, to your question of the role of government obviously doesn't run supply chains, and we don't want to be in the business of running supply chains. Like, very clearly do not want to be in that business. This is a private sector endeavor, massively complicated, global in nature. What we do need to do, though, is support our businesses. We want to, you know, for a long time, there's been this obsession with just in time. And I think we're learning that there are limitations to the just in time approach. It doesn't take into account, you know, resiliency, as Tharman was saying, you know, just in case, right? We have to think about just in case we have a COVID-like event, climate event. So our role in government, I think, is to encourage the private sector to add more resiliency to supply chains, more suppliers, more transparency. You know, the president has encouraged ports to move to be 24/7. That is obviously vital at the moment and probably should be maintained as such going forward. I have been, the Commerce Department, you asked about us, we've been convening CEOs of semiconductor chip companies constantly, collecting data from them, pushing for more transparency. You know, when there's a lack of transparency in a supply chain, lack of trust develops. Suppliers worry are consumers hoarding or stockpiling? Consumers wonder, where are all the chips going? Am I getting my fair share? So one thing that we are trying to do in the government at the Commerce Department is increase transparency, which ought to increase trust. And then earlier I mentioned this concept of friend shoring. It used to be near shoring, although of course our Indo-Pacific allies are not really near, but they are certainly friends. And in today's globalized economy, when a factory shuts down in Malaysia due to a COVID outbreak, it can have an outsized effect in our own backyard. So developing resiliency is critical, and when you, in order to develop that resiliency, we have to coordinate our investments in supply chains across the globe. And in that respect, the Commerce Department will be in the middle of that, really encouraging this cross-border investment and collaboration, which will accrue to the benefit of really, the whole world, not just America.
Thank you. We have a lot to get through, and we're hearing new terms coined as we go. So this is history making. This is good. Tharman, you've been very focused recently, for good reason, on the global inequalities in vaccine production and distribution, as well as thinking about the next pandemic. Could you say a bit more about the supply chain aspects of that, what you want to see happen in that space with regards to vaccines and pandemic, both now and for future?
That's a large new problem in public policy, Adam, that we haven't faced before. Put squarely, it is a challenge of having substantial overcapacity in vaccine manufacturing ahead of a pandemic of uncertain timing and uncertain nature. And we've learned that we need that overcapacity ahead of a pandemic from the experience of the last 2 years. Because what we know from the last 2 years is that responding to a pandemic in ways that avoid prolonging a pandemic and avoid the staggering inequalities that we've seen is all about speed and scale. What we saw at remarkable speed was the development of vaccines, development, testing, and approval of vaccines. But 2 years on, the bulk of the world's population hasn't been vaccinated. And that, by its very nature, has allowed for continuous mutation of the virus and is prolonging the pandemic. So if we want to avoid that in future, we need to be able to respond much more swiftly and on a global scale once a pandemic strikes. And you can't do that unless you have at-ready facilities, ever-warm facilities, both manufacturing and delivery capacity, an end-to-end supply system. If you don't have that, it's going to take 2 years once again, and at enormous costs for countries individually and collectively. Now, that's a new public policy challenge because the private sector does not have an incentive to invest in overcapacity ahead of a pandemic. Second, the private sector will not know, none of us knows exactly which pathogen is going to be the source of the pandemic, and does not know which vaccine candidate is going to be successful, is going to go through phase 3 trials successfully and get approved. We don't know in advance. So you need to have multiple vaccine candidates, and you need to have facilities that are able to produce different candidates, and you need them to be globally distributed as well. So they're a little more resilient to some of the short-term supply chain problems or even protectionist actions in a major crisis. So it does require, because you can't rely on the private sector, it doesn't have enough commercial incentive to do it ahead of time and to have it spread across candidates of uncertain success probabilities. You need a public-private collaboration. The one thing that worked better in the US than elsewhere was precisely that system involving BARDA and several other public agencies that, by the way, looked it's not the America that people think of very often, but it's actually a very active role for the state, coordinated with the private sector, and even with the US Army involved, that managed to actually get vaccine development and production out as quickly as possible. And what we need really is a global BARDA, or if you like, a network of BARDA-like entities. Europe has now started HERA. You've got the African Vaccine Alliance. You need a network that connects regional and large country capabilities into a coherent global system. Again, the market doesn't do this. We need a way of coordinating capacity ahead of time and fast response in an actual crisis. And it's not going to happen without a deep collaboration between the public and private sector internationally. And it can be achieved. It can be achieved. And that's exactly why we need the G20 task force, coming in part out of the proposals of the high-level independent panel that I co-chaired with Larry Summers and Ngozi, to address this forthrightly. It requires global coordination. It is complex in details, but not complex in principle. The principle is it's in every country and region's interest to collaborate in setting up this end-to-end supply ecosystem. It requires public sector money, but we should use that public sector money to incentivize and catalyze private investment. That's our challenge. We haven't faced this challenge before. I mean, perhaps we should have done it after Ebola. We didn't. Each time a pandemic hits, the political appetite for fundamental reform fades once we are past the worst, and particularly once we are past the worst in the most advanced nations. We must not allow that to happen again. We must not allow pandemic memory to disappear from the system. We don't want to remember the horrendous human costs, but we need pandemic memory built into the system so it never happens again.
Thank you, Tharman. Secretary Raimondo, well, of course, again, you're welcome to comment on the vaccines. I want to go back with our limited time to the announcement you made on behalf of the Biden administration, which has been filled in a bit, about the step back in the tariff conflict between the US and EU. I'm using the term step back because it's not a full resolution, it's not a full withdrawal of tariffs, but it was a change. First, just can you say a bit more about what damages to various groups, producers, consumers in the US retaliated against industries led to you and the administration taking the step? And second, in light of your remarks a few minutes ago about nearshoring isn't as good as friendshoring because our friends are not necessarily just who are adjacent. There are a lot of allies, including Japan, Korea, that are not in the EU that were caught up in this tariff battle by the Trump administration. Can we hope that you'll be treating some of the other allies who are not in the direct EU deal similarly?
Yeah. So first, let me say in response to Tharman, I love pandemic memory. This is, of course, easier said than done because human nature being as it is, we react to crisis and then we think it's fine. But I think that's our third. We have friendshoring, just in case, and now pandemic memory. I love that. And I think we ought to hold ourselves accountable to having that memory. So we take the steps now to develop the resiliency so that next time this happens, and it will happen, as you just said, we should have done it post-Ebola, we will be ready. So we can work on that together. In any event, the announcement about the 232 tariffs was really quite significant. The EU was planning to impose 50% tariffs on December 1st, automatically on December 1st, a 50% tariff on a range of important American products, bourbon, whiskey, rye, the entire distillery industry, I mean, which is, by the way, the greatest source of jobs in the state of Kentucky. So it would have decimated Kentucky's economy. No, I think we should all stipulate you can't survive with a 50% tariff. I mean, it's a quite excessive tariff. Harley-Davidson, which has thousands of employees in Wisconsin, would have, I don't know, probably had to shut down that plant or certainly ratcheted back significantly. Levi's, jeans, I mean, really iconic American brands. So thankfully that will not happen. The tariffs will not be imposed, and that's really a huge win for those industries. Just as important, if not more important, it's a really important moment in our transatlantic relationship with the EU. President Biden came into office pledging that we were going to repair our relationships with our allies, and this is proof. You know, this is putting that principle into action. We worked with the EU to resolve this trade irritant. It will allow millions of tons of steel to come into America from the EU duty-free, tariff-free, which is obviously very important. Importantly, though, it requires that the steel and aluminum be produced in the EU. So, you know, the enemy here was never the EU. Our shared enemy was Chinese dumping of their excess capacity into the world market, distorting the global steel market, hurting the EU and EU workers and America. So this is a very significant action whereby we are working with our allies to push back on Chinese excess capacity, thereby protecting the industry and workers in the US and the EU in the steel industry. Obviously, in this moment, as we are struggling with supply chain disruption and price increases, this is also a tremendous step forward in that regard. The industry, I mean, steel is in everything. It's in your car, it's in your truck, it's in your dishwasher, your refrigerator, your dryer. So this, of course, will bring down prices for these companies, which will flow through to the consumer. Here in America, steel prices have gone up almost fourfold in the past 12 months. So this is really very significant. And to your question of our allies, we will, yes, get to work working with our allies, like-minded, as you say, Japan and the UK, you know, and really try to resolve the same trade irritant with them as well.
Thank you. I'm afraid I have to do one follow-up on that. If the enemy is Chinese overproduction, what's the irritant from the UK and Asian allies that you want to continue this?
Oh, sorry, we haven't resolved the 232 tariffs with the UK. So in other words, the deal that we struck with the EU is with the EU.
No, sorry, I understand. I was just asking, since you said just a minute ago, the purpose ultimately is to deal with Chinese overcapacity and supply. Why are you not just lifting similarly for other allies the way you're lifting for the EU?
Yeah, I think we will get there. We just, that's what I'm trying to say. We did this with the EU. Now we have to sit down with our other allies and come up with negotiate. We have to do the work to sit down to negotiate to see if we can't also get rid of this irritant with those allies.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. Tharman, as one of those U.S. allies, Singapore is obviously not a steel exporter, so you don't have, or aluminum exporter, you don't have this issue of directly of the 232s, but you are aware, obviously, of the Biden approach and the previous Trump approach on these matters. Speaking not for other U.S. Asian allies, but as a U.S. Asian ally, how do you see the Biden administration's partial continuation of this approach?
Well, I think Singapore's perspective is predictable. As you say, we are not a steel or aluminum producer, but steel and aluminum go into lots of other things. And the world economy is going to be a weaker economy if we do not see a rollback of all forms of protection and discrimination. And I think as we come out of COVID and as we address an extremely challenging period ahead, we should try as much as we can, because there's some problems which are really difficult to solve and difficult to solve quickly. We should try as much as we can to roll back on the problems that are easier to solve. And it requires, of course, not just international negotiations and some give and take on both sides. It requires also the appropriate domestic strategies, which Secretary Raimondo also touched on briefly in her opening remarks. That's what I think every responsible government has to do. Find ways of freeing up internationally, but double down on the right domestic social and economic strategies to preserve inclusiveness and ensure that you've got that broad base of good jobs that are being created. Not always the same jobs that existed before, but you're always catering to that broad base of the workforce with good jobs.
So, thank you, Tharman. Let me try to be a little bit provocative to both of you on this, because I know you care deeply about this link between social cohesion or social justice, I shouldn't say or, and social justice with international commerce. Speaking as an economist, not a policymaker, the record of creating so-called good jobs is not very good in the sense of governments being able to will them into being. And in fact, there's a lot of record of trying to create good jobs and ending up creating negative feedback loops, entitled groups, actual more rather than less conflict inside societies, regional differences being perpetuated. Again, it's very different for a small economy like Singapore geographically and a continent-wide economy like the US, but both are multi-ethnic democracies. And so there are a lot of commonalities as well. We've been fortunate in the past at Peterson Institute to have Tharman speak about this. Secretary Raimondo, maybe go to you first. Just what is your vision for how, we've heard the phrase trade policy for the middle class repeatedly from officials at your level in the Biden administration. What is your vision for how this should be integrated into both commerce and social justice? How do we think about this, particularly since the world, let's remember, is not all about manufacturing jobs. No matter how many manufacturing jobs we're going to create, it's not going to be everybody or even close to a majority in any society. Sorry to go on so long, but I want to set it up for your broad think as part of the Next Step conference. So please, Secretary Raimondo of the Department.
Yes, no, you're exactly right. And by the way, as you say, although we are going to work very hard to enhance manufacturing in America, for example, on semiconductors, something I spend a lot of time on, we want to make more chips in America. That's clear. We will create thousands of jobs doing that. That's clear. Having said that, manufacturing is becoming more automated. So you're exactly right. Even if we have more manufacturing in America, it is more automated, and not everyone can have a manufacturing job. And to your point around social cohesion, look, I believe our nation is at an inflection point. So we have unprecedented income inequality in our country. Inequality based on geography, race, educational attainment. And it's why the President Biden said we're in a fight for the soul of America. So many of our problems as a country have been created and exacerbated by that economic inequality. And so we have to meet the demands of the moment if we're going to really address that inequality. I will say, that's why we are so focused on passing the president's Build Back Better agenda, because it will enable, for example, broadband, high quality, affordable, high speed broadband for every single American. You know, you cannot have broadly shared prosperity if 35% of Americans who live in rural areas don't have access to broadband. You can't do it. 50% of Americans who live on tribal lands don't have access to broadband. Workforce development. President's calling for big investments in apprenticeships. Well, when you think apprenticeship, maybe the image that comes into your mind is the building trades, plumbers, welders, and that's all good. I think digital apprenticeships. I think cybersecurity technicians. I think cyber tech apprenticeships in middle America for, you know, Black and brown kids in urban America who need access to these skills so they can get these jobs, so they can come into the workforce, stay in the workforce, and make a decent income. So there's no, you know, I could go on all morning and I promise I won't, but like the point is we need, as Tharman said, domestic investments, building our infrastructure, investing in technology, investing in basic R&D, basic research and development. Over the past 30 years, if you were to draw a graph, you're an economist, Adam, if you were to graph, you know, R&D investments as a percent of American GDP, it would be a straight downward slope. We need to invest in R&D so that that turns into, you know, more manufacturing, get the great ideas coming out of colleges and universities and turn them into products we make in America, all over America, middle America as well, and then have, you know, the job training initiatives to make sure people get these jobs. So in any event, I think there's no one thing. I think it is the challenge of our time. And President Biden has a very bold set of programs to make those investments so that we can, you know, create those jobs and have the prosperity be more equally shared in America. But last thing I'll say, you know, like women, 2 million women are still out of the workforce now, post-COVID. They will stay out of the workforce unless childcare becomes more affordable. Why can every other industrialized nation in the world provide public pre-K and childcare and we can't? If we don't make those investments, we will not tap into women's economic potential, and it will continue to erode this social cohesion that you talk about. So there's no one thing, but I think it is the most important thing that we'll work on as an administration.
Thank you very much, Secretary Raimondo. I cannot resist on your last comment, just throwing my full weight, such as it is, behind it. The success of Abenomics, Womenomics in Japan to turn around female labor force participation shows it can be done, and that pre-K, nursery school, leave for flexible work policies for women and support for women getting equal pay, but necessary support for their role in the family, I think is critical. And of all the things you've mentioned, I am proud that the Biden administration is taking that on. Tharman, forgive me for editorializing, but as you know, we at Peterson have been working on that issue for a long time. So to wrap us up, maybe you could say a few words also about how you see trade and inclusion coming together.
Well, very much in the same spirit as Secretary Raimondo. And, you know, reflecting on that earlier remark you made, Adam, about how, well, look, this hasn't worked very well in the past, the state getting involved in industry. The two things that didn't work well in the past were first, the state trying to pick winners in private industry, individual firms, sometimes even individual clusters or industries, hasn't had a great record. Second, subsidized state enterprise. That hasn't worked well anywhere in the world. And we used to associate that as a problem to do with the socialist economies, but it's a problem that's lived on well beyond socialism in a whole range of other economies. And I should just add as a important aside for those of us who are economists that 2 weeks ago we saw the passing of Janos Kornai, who was perhaps more than anyone else, the person who exposed the systemic weaknesses of the socialist economies, and the fact that soft budget constraints were not just accidental, not just political, they were systematic. But Kornai's soft budget constraints exist in a whole range of other economies, even after the falling of the Berlin Wall. And we should be well aware of that. So that's the old industrial policy weaknesses that we know of, the old dirigism. But what Secretary Raimondo was talking about, and what I believe we need to address now with the renewed energy, is the development of collective capacity, not picking individual winners, not trying to have subsidized state enterprises, creating a new infant industry. It's really about developing collective capacity. And that means everything from a strong preschool sector to provide opportunities for social mobility, or at least not stunt social mobility early in life. It means a high quality public school sector. It means broadband, as Secretary Raimondo was emphasizing, broadband across the full span of the population. And it's not just a huge problem in the developing world, it's also a problem in the most advanced countries. You have large parts of major cities in the advanced countries, including the United States, where the majority of the population does not have broadband. It means on a global scale, girls' education, which is a huge collective capacity issue, quite apart from being imposing severe inequality, gender inequality in those societies. It's a huge issue of collective capacity as well. And I would like to highlight one issue which economists are familiar with, but doesn't translate enough into public policy. And that is that we do have to address what is now a very stubborn problem of low productivity growth across the advanced world and slowing productivity growth in the emerging world. If you take the mature economies, the US is doing a little better than most in the last few years, but if you take the mature economies as a whole, productivity growth was running at slightly above 2% in the years before the global financial crisis, the first part of the decade. It was running at about 1% after the global financial crisis for about a whole decade. And it's now still stuck there. In fact, even in 2020, which saw things come down and then go up, you're still running at about 1%. And what's important is that we have reduced diffusion, reduced spread of innovation and productivity improvements from the frontiers to the rest of the economy. Because that's always been the big game in productivity growth. It's really the spread of innovations and breakthroughs from a leader and a leading sector, all those at the frontier, to the rest of the economy. That's what uplifts the system as a whole, and that's what leads to wages rising across the board. And we've seen systematically reduced spread of innovation and productivity growth. The reasons are complex. They may have to do with increasing concentration in industry, which is something that's been measured. But I think this challenge in public policy is also important.
Thank you.
What do we do? What do we do to avoid concentration of not just power, but concentration of innovation amongst a few and enable its spread?
Thank you, Tharman. Sorry to end right there, although I think that is a critical issue, which, as you know, Peterson Institute's been working on, the G7, the G20, and we're very glad to have you bring the long-term productivity and the diffusion of innovation to be part of this picture. I want to thank Secretary Gina Raimondo, Senior Minister Tharman, for gracing us with their presence and their frank, practical combination of commitment and policy steps.